Yo, what's up guys? So I know a lot of you guys have been asking me for a Lightroom editing tutorial, so I made it a point today to actually show you guys how I normally edit my pictures. So I'm gonna show you guys two different types of edits, one with the preset and one without from scratch. So this editing tutorial is also to commemorate my milestone hitting 40k on Instagram. So just want to thank you guys and thought of just making this video to give back to you guys. Okay, so before we start, I just want to show you guys the Lightroom that I'm using. I'm actually using Adobe Lightroom Classic CC 7.1. So if your Lightroom is actually looking a bit different, or if you don't have a specific function that I have, it's probably because you're not using the latest Lightroom. Okay, so I'm just gonna start editing this picture. Normally what I do is I will actually run through my presets beforehand to try and find something that actually fits the mood of the target, the final product that I wanna achieve with the photo. So I'm thinking maybe, okay, let's just start with this one. So this is a preset from my preset pack. I'll leave a link in the description below, so if you guys are interested to check out my preset pack, you can go ahead and do that. Okay, so normally what I usually start with is I go to my lens corrections, I click on remove chromatic aberration and then enable profile corrections. So this was shot on a Canon 70-200. Yeah, so what enabling profile corrections actually does is it just removes like the lens vignetting on the sides. Okay, I think I should start even before I use a preset. What I normally do is I go to my lens corrections, and do the normal stuff. I go to my camera calibration and then I change it to camera standard just to give that pop of color. Because when you shoot in RAW, right, a lot of times the pictures come out really flat, and in order to have a base of when you want to start your edit, I normally go into my camera profile and select camera standard, or whichever profile that fits more to your color needs. So for example, if you're shooting a portrait, you can try using camera portrait, but for this picture I'm just going to use camera standard. And then from there I move on to my transform tab. Sometimes I use auto, but so like a lot of times Lightroom does a really good job of straightening your pictures, but most of the time if you want to be super accurate, what I normally do is I click this icon on the left here, and then I try to align, try to find somewhere that's vertical and then manually align them. So let's just pick somewhere over, okay, hang on, let me just redo that. Let's say maybe I click on this pillar here, okay, this corner, and then I'm just gonna drag it down and find somewhere that I know is straight, maybe over here. Okay, and then I'm gonna do the same thing for the other side. I'm gonna just click this corner and then drag it down. Okay, boom, and then the picture is automatically straightened. So if you're a little bit more OCD, you can even do it horizontally, but I think for this image it's perfectly straightened already, so I'm just gonna leave it as it is. Okay, next step, if I'm gonna start a picture editing from scratch, I'll go into my basic settings, but I'll save that for later. So I'm just gonna click on the aftershock preset that we selected just now. Okay, so looking at this image, it's a little bit dark and I don't really like it looking as it is, so I'm just gonna bump up the exposure and make it 0 again. So even before I start editing, what I normally do is I actually crop it into the Instagram crop. Yeah, it's just a personal preference, because like if you're actually editing it and let's say you add a vignette, right, and you don't actually crop it to your Instagram crop, so let's just say I leave it as it is and I actually add some vignetting. When you actually transfer it into when you actually export it onto your phone and you import into and you upload it onto Instagram actually crops out, it crops out to the 4:5 crop, so you're actually losing the top half or bottom half of the vignette that you initially already added, which defeats the purpose of adding the vignette in the first place. So what I normally like to do is I just crop it within Lightroom, and then from there whatever settings that I do, and then when I export it onto my iPhone and eventually upload it onto Instagram, it's exactly the same as I see it when I edited it. Okay, so let's just start with the basic settings. When I look at this picture, I think everything is quite nice already. I like really high contrast pictures, so this image does quite a good job already. However, I think the highlights a little bit too harsh, maybe on the left side, so I'm just gonna bring the highlights down quite a bit and maybe pull down the shadows and just playing around with the settings. I think this kind of works. And then yeah, okay, so one thing I noticed is that my subject over here is a little bit too dark. So what I can do is I'll use a radial filter, and then I drag like a circle, an oval over him, and I'll just manually brighten him, bumping up the exposure, maybe bringing up the shadows a little bit because it's too dark, so he's losing a bit of details in his jacket, and then maybe just bumping the highlights just a tad bit. Okay, I think he looks a lot better. So let's just check the before and after with the radial filter and without. So yeah, it makes a little bit of difference. You know, when you look at the picture, you immediately notice that there's a subject in the frame, whereas if it's a little bit too dark, you know, it draws a bit of the attention away from the subject. So okay, there's that. And then I think we sort of have the basic settings. Maybe add a little bit of clarity, maybe +5. Okay, and then moving down to tone curve. So a lot of times in my pictures nowadays, I don't actually like to put a lot of fade into my edits. So what I normally do is I would bring it down. So the end point is actually, the last point on the left is what determines the fade. So if you want it to be more faded, all you have to do is just, oops, all I have to do is just click on the point and then bump it up, and it adds more fade. So this is a little bit too exaggerated. So what I like to do is I like to start from scratch, and then I slowly just bump it up by a bit and see where it hits. I think this is about enough. Okay, I kind of like it this way. So creating the natural S-curve gives it a slight contrast. Yeah. I'm not gonna go too detailed into the tone curve. Maybe in future tutorials, you know, if the response is good, I can go into like into more details of how I actually do my tone curves. But I think for this editing tutorial, I'm just gonna leave it to the basics. Okay, moving on to the HSL tabs. So the building is originally blue, but I think this keeping it at 0 is a bit too saturated. So I'm just gonna bring it down, maybe to about -79. Yeah, that kind of works. Kind of like it like this. Okay, another thing I noticed is that my subject over here is a little bit too orange. So what I like to do is I use this little toggle switch over here, and then I can move on to the selective color that I want, and I can manually just click on him and then just drag him up or down, and Lightroom actually controls the saturation for you, so you don't have to, you know, manually come into the orange and then desaturate. And you can just click on his skin or whatever you want on the picture to actually control it. It not only works on the saturation, you can do it for the hue and the luminance as well, or even in the tone curve. So I think this is about right. Yeah, he looks a lot better now. So moving on to split toning. Split toning, I think this is not too bad. I'll explain a little bit more about how I use my split toning when I edit a different photo from scratch, but for right now I think this is fine, so I'm just gonna keep it as it is. And for detailing, for architecture photos, I like to you know, have a high sharpening value, but for this image I shot it at f2.8, so most of the picture is actually bokeh, except for my subject over here, so it's not necessary to actually have like a high sharpening value. So I'm just going to keep it maybe at 50, and then I can click on the masking, and holding down alternate I can actually see what is being masked out. So the areas that I blacked are actually the ones, the area that the sharpening is not taking effect. So just bumping it up reduces the area that is being sharpened. So for these kinds of images, I only need the edges to be sharpened, so I'm just going to bump it up quite a bit, and I think this works. Okay, noise reduction I don't have to because this was shot at ISO 125, and then I'm just going to leave it as it is. So we've already completed our transform tab, so I'm not going to do anything on that. So under the vignetting section again, under effects, I'm just going to add maybe a little bit of vignette to sort of like darken the sides, you know. So when you look at a picture, normally when the viewer looks at a picture, your eyes are actually drawn to the brightest area of the picture. So if you actually have like a subject right in the center, having vignette and on the sides help to draw the attention to the center of the image. So for this picture, I think my focus is actually on the bottom left, so I'm not going to add a little bit, not going to add a lot of vignetting, but just adding it maybe -21 creates like a, you know, a dark area over on the right, and I kind of like it because it has like a gradient, you know, from the bright, and then you sort of see you know, you sort of see the subject looking into the darkness, and there's sort of like a gradient. So I can actually exaggerate that by using a graduated filter. So just holding it down and maybe stretching it across like so, and then I'm just gonna maybe bring down the exposure. So another tip is you can actually click O, and this red, actually the red comes up and it shows you like how the graduated filter is actually affecting the picture. So it starts from very saturated, and then it slowly graduates out. So I'm going to maybe bring down the highlights a little bit and the shadows. So right now it's a little bit too harsh, so I'm just gonna stretch this out maybe a little bit more. Yeah, I think that kind of works. So I think for this image, yeah, I kind of like it. So if you actually click on Y, you can actually see like the before and after. So this is the before, and then this is the after image. And another way to actually see the before and after is also click like the slash button on your keyboard, and you can see them like so. Okay, so and all of you guys have been asking me on what my export settings are and stuff like that. I'm going to actually show you guys that later on when I edit another picture from scratch. So okay, I think let's move on to the next image. Okay, so when I edit an image from scratch, so same thing applies. I like to go into my lens correction, you know, do my manual lens correction, and then my camera calibration, camera standard, and then I go on to transform it and make everything as straight as possible. Maybe we'll click on this pillar over here, and then just stretching it down. Yeah, I think that's good. And then doing the same on this side. So for places like this where you know, you have very prominent horizontal and vertical lines, it's a lot easier for you to do this manually. So you can actually even do it horizontally like so, and you can actually create up to 4 points to make sure that your image is perfectly aligned. There we go. Okay, so now we actually transformed the image to make them aligned, and then I'm just gonna crop it again 4x5, trying to find the center of the image. So what I'm doing is I'm using this point right here and this point. When I click outside of the picture, that there's a straight line, and then trying it to align it to the center of the image. So for this image is this art piece over here. So that seems about right. And then just checking on the top left hand corner where you have like a smaller overview of the whole image. Just looking at it from afar, I can sort of see like, you know, the things that I'm missing out when I'm looking up close on it. So I think this is about right. Okay, so sometimes when you take pictures, you have you know, you can't actually crop out everything, because for this picture, for example, I think this banner is a little bit too distracting. We can actually, you know, manually get rid of that in Photoshop, but it's a little too tedious, and I think for this image is okay. Another trick you can do is you can actually crop it further in, but it defeats the purpose because like the sides are actually not as wide anymore. So I'm just gonna leave the banner in. Okay, so from here I go on into my basic settings as usual. I think the exposure is okay for this one. I'm gonna bring down the highlights just a little bit and bump up the shadows. Okay, no, I think it's not that great, because for this picture, as you can notice, the corridors are actually really messy, and there's a lot of things that are distracting the image. So a lot of times when you're editing a picture or when you're shooting a picture, you need to know what you want to focus on and what you want the focus of the picture to be. Because I receive a lot of you know, pictures from you guys, from DMs, and you guys are asking me for feedback and stuff like that. You guys have great images, but most of the time a lot of the pictures lack focus, and Yeah, so for example, for this image, I think like it's a really simple architecture picture, but the focus is quite prominent because like I have all these leading lines from the side and they sort of lead your eyes towards the center, so you have all these images and stuff like that, but there's no one concrete focus. So it depends on what kind of photos you're taking. Like, you know, for example, if you're doing a portrait shoot or maybe like a nature landscape photo, which maybe I can do a tutorial on that in the future, but for now, yeah, let's just focus on this architecture picture. So continuing from what I said just now, I'm just gonna bring down the shadows, so you know, all these distracting stuff on the corridors are being blacked out, and you know, you can sort of like simplify the picture in a sense that you're just making whatever you don't want to be in the photo unseen. So maybe bringing it a little drastic, and -56 will do. Just gonna bump up the white again to bring back that contrast, and then the blacks, it's already pretty harsh, so I'm just gonna maybe bring it down by a bit. Okay, so now we're going into our tone curves. I'll just add my usual points, 1, 2, and 3 over here, and then what I normally like to do first is I like to add the fade in. So from completely clean, I'm just gonna move it up a little bit, and I think the image is already black enough, so I'm not gonna move this point, but I'm gonna move this up and create you know, just bump up the highlights a little bit. I think the mid-tones are a little bit too dark as well, so just bumping it up. So if you don't know what the tone curve actually does, I'm not gonna go too much into detail on this, but just playing around with the settings, you know, adding like manual points like this as a start, and then just moving them around, you can sort of like understand how it relates to the picture. And just through practice and editing different pictures, you sort of like get a better understanding of what the tone curve does, and from there you can, you know, whenever you edit the picture, you sort of like have an idea already of what you're trying to achieve. So every time you edit, the more you edit, the faster you get. And that's, I guess, like that's the whole point of just practicing and making your pictures better. Okay, so I think a simple tone curve like this will do. Just checking the before and after. Yeah, not really drastic, just adding a bit of fade back down. Okay, I think I like it like this. Okay, let's move on to, I think the colors are okay, because like for this image, there's not a lot of colors going on. But when you look at this picture, you know, the main colors are actually black and white, so having like all these green and yellow is a little bit distracting, and it drags the focus. It gives like a different focus to the image, because when people look at this picture, they're naturally drawn to things that stand out, right? So in this case, it's actually like these green boards over here, but as a composer or as a photographer, that's not the main focus that I want to do. So during my edits, it depends on, I can actually desaturate it out, or if I really want to go to a greater extent, I can remove it manually in Photoshop. But for now, I think I'm just going to desaturate it and see what it does. Yeah, I think that does the trick. And then maybe the yellows here, desaturate it a little bit. Okay, it's not making much of a difference, but I think that's fine. Okay, so not a lot of other colors going on in the image, so I think I'm just gonna leave it as it is. Maybe like I'll, you know, just change the hues of the yellow and make it a little bit more orange, because when you're desaturating all the yellows and oranges, is basically just a black and white photo. And I guess if you're going for that look, it's fine, but for most of the time I don't like those just black and white look, you know. It's a little bit too boring for me, so just leaving a little bit of yellows and oranges in the photo, yeah, that's what I like. Okay, so moving down to split toning. Okay, so a lot of times when you're editing a picture, you want to manually, like, you know, add like cool tones, or maybe make it a little bit warmer. And if you don't want to play around with the white balance tool, you can actually do it in split toning. So what I like to do is I'll bump up the saturation to maybe +10, and then I'll hold down alternate and click on the hue, and then just adjust them. I'll just move along the slider and see what colors actually fit. Let's maybe go with like a blue. Yeah, and then I'll just move it back to 0, and then I'll just slowly you know, just add it back to see if it's a little bit too much. I'm just going to bring it down, but I think +4 is fine. Okay, another reason why I actually start with the shadows and not the highlights is because I like to edit pictures that have high contrast, so most of the details in the pictures are actually in the shadows. So I like to you know, just make the adjustment to these shadows first so it's more prominent around the picture, and then from there I move on to the highlights. You don't have to do this, but this is just how I like to go about my edits. And I do the same thing for my saturation. I bump it up to 10, and then I hold on alternate, or I just move along the slider and try to find something that fits. I think maybe around here will be good, and then I'll just bring it back to 0 again and just manually adding it in. And turning on the before and after helps as well, because sometimes when you get too deep in your editing, you sort of like lose focus on how you want your image to be. So just like checking the before and after gives you a better context of what you're actually doing. So right now I'm just checking before, it's a little warm, and then I'm adding the cool tones back, but I think like the shadows might be a little bit too much. I actually think 0 is actually good. It's not too bad, and then just adding a tad bit onto the highlights kind of works. Yeah, I kind of like it like this. And you know, you can always play around with the balance if you're not happy with the adjustments that you made. So just moving around, I think this kind of works. Okay. And then detailing. So for this image, I shot it at f7.1, so everything should be in focus and sharp. To further exaggerate that, you can, you know, bump up the sharpening. For this image, I think I'm gonna use 90, and then I'll just mask out whatever I don't want to be sharpened. You don't want to overdo it, because a lot of times when you're adding unnecessary sharpening, it creates noise in your image, which I mean, if that's the effect that you're going for, then yeah, do it. But for me, I don't like to add grain or any unnecessary noise in my images, so that it looks as clean as possible. So yeah, I shot this at ISO 160, so I don't need no noise reduction, so I'm just gonna leave it as it is. We've already covered lens correction and transform. And then for effects, for images like this where the focus is actually in the center, I normally bring down my vignette to sort of create, like, darken the side. So, you know, when, like I mentioned before, your eyes are actually drawn to what is brightest in the picture. So for this image, is actually this walls on the side, so we can always use a graduated filter and sort of darken it. But for now, I think maybe this will do. Okay, let's just use a graduated filter and sort of like get rid of that brightness in the wall. Let's just say I'll bring down the highlights. Okay, that's a little bit too much. Let's check the before and after. Okay, a lot better. Yep. And then maybe just pushing. Okay, I think that's not too bad, but I still think like the center is a little bit too dark, so I'm maybe just gonna bump up the exposure. I can even add like a radial filter and sort of brighten the center, but I think for this and then I go down to camera calibration. For, you know, you can play around with these settings, but I think for this image where most of the colors are actually just black and white, I don't need to do any adjustments. And then I guess, yeah, the picture looks good as it is. Oh, another thing is, I think the bottom half of this image is a little bit too dark, so I can go ahead and add a graduated filter again and just drag it from the bottom up and maybe try to balance it out a little bit more. And just up the exposure. Yeah. Oops. I think, yeah, this kind of works. And then just checking the before and after. Nice. Okay. So let's click on Y again, and then we can see the before and after. Really like how it looks. So before and after. Okay, quite a simple edit. So right now I'm just going to show you guys my export settings. I don't usually, you know, there's nothing too fancy about my export settings. A lot of you guys have been asking me why are my images sharper than yours when I upload onto Instagram. So if you think it's the export settings, I'm just going to share with you what I do. I basically just max out all my settings. I use quality 100 and 300 ppi as my resolution. Another tip is that I don't know how you guys actually export your photos from your desktop into your phone, but for me, I used to use Google Drive. However, I noticed that Google Drive actually compresses your images, so you're actually losing quality when you actually import it onto your phone, and Instagram naturally compresses your photos. So in that case, if you're using Google Drive, you're actually compressing it twice. That's why your images might not be as sharp as you want them to be. So a solution I found for me was to use Telegram. So you can actually download Telegram onto your desktop and the app onto your phone, and then you can manually send files through the app and receive it on your phone. So that way you don't lose any of the resolution of your images. And when you're uploading it onto Instagram, you're actually getting somewhat of the full resolution. Yeah, I guess that is about it. I don't actually do any further sharpening in Photoshop and stuff like that. I think I've seen tutorials on people doing that to sort of like counter the compression on Instagram, but I think my images are pretty sharp already, so I don't actually do any extra editing on Photoshop. Yeah, I guess that's about it. So if you guys have any questions, you can leave them in the comment section below. I'll try my best to answer most of them. And if you have any suggestions on what you want to see in the future, more tutorials or how I compose my images, stuff like that, just leave them in comments as well. And also, if you haven't already checked out my Hong Kong video that I did, do check it out. I'll leave a link in the description as well. And yeah, I guess that's about it. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.